What's up, everybody? Welcome back. Patrick here. Moving on with leasing timing differences. We're now going to do another example. Now, before doing this example, I'd highly recommend you watch the previous two when we did it with straight line depreciation and CCA depreciation. The process is going to be very similar, so it's just going to make your life a lot easier when watching this one. Another thing is that this example, like the previous two as well, has its own Excel file, and this specific question you can only answer with the Excel file. So you can download that and follow along. I'll leave a link to it in the description box. So let's read what is going on here. So we have a lessor. They buy a machine for $120,000 and rent it out to a lessee for 4 years. The machine has a CCA rate of 100% and will have a salvage value of 0 at the end of 4 years. The discount rate is 7%. The lessor and lessee have tax rates of 35% and 10% respectively. Lease payments are tax deductible and made at the beginning of each year. And there's 3 parts to this question. Part A, what range of lease payments will make the transaction profitable for both parties? Part B, at the lessee's break-even lease payment, what will be the gain to the lessor? And then Part C, at the lessor's break-even lease payment, what will be the gain to the lessee? Now, another thing that actually just came to mind when I read this is notice that we're going to be dealing with a range of lease payments that make the transaction profitable for both parties, and that's because the tax rates are different. And we actually went over this when we talked about the leasing paradox. So I'd actually recommend that you watch that video series before watching this one as well, so you understand how we get this range of lease payments for Part A. Even though in that example there was no timing differences between the lease payment and the tax shield, it still gives you a good idea of what's going on and what we mean by that range. Now, to start this question off, I'm going to create a CCA schedule for this machine at that CCA rate of 100%. Reason is because we're going to be using this schedule in parts A, B, and C. So thought I would start off with this portion of the question first. So in year 1, the UCC at the beginning is just basically the cost of the machine, $120,000. And we are depreciating this machine at a CCA rate of 100%. So if we take 120,000 multiplied by 100%, that's just 120,000. However, in that first year, we're only allowed to take half of that amount. So 120,000 times 100% is 120,000 divided by 2 gives us 60,000. So at the end of the first year, the UCC is going to be the UCC at the beginning minus that CCA of 60,000, giving us a UCC at the end of the first year of 60,000. And then that is going to carry over here. So the UCC at the beginning of the second year is 60,000. And now we could take a full depreciation on it because it's not the first year anymore. We don't have to apply that half-year rule. So 60,000 multiplied by 100% gives us 60,000. So then the UCC at the end of the second year is just going to be 0. So even though we're dealing with a timeline of 4 years, notice with the CCA schedule, it's only for 2 years because of that very high CCA rate. There's no more depreciation to take after that second year. So we have the CCA column, but remember when we are creating that timeline that we did in the previous 2 questions, we need the actual tax shield. And notice that the tax rates of the lessor and the lessee are different in this case. So we're actually going to be using a different tax shield for the lessor and a different tax shield for the lessee in this question. We need both because we're going to have to calculate break-even lease payments for both of them, and we're going to have to use their respective tax rates. And the tax rate for the lessor is given as 35%. So let's just actually write that up here just for reference. And then the lessee is 10%. So the CCA tax shield for the lessor is just going to be the CCA amounts multiplied by 35%. So 60,000 times 0.35 gives us 21,000. And that's the same amount in the second year because the CCA amount is the same. Now, usually the CCA amount differs in schedules, but it's just the same because of this 100%. It just works out to be the same. It's just coincidence. It's not like it's being depreciated straight line. It's still CCA depreciation, but because of that 100% CCA rate, your schedule is always going to look like this, and that CCA is just going to be the same, but that is just coincidence. And then the lessee tax shield is going to be the CCA amount multiplied by the tax rate for the lessee, 10%. So 60,000 times 0.1 gives us 6,000 in years 1 and 2 for the tax shield. So these are the two columns that we are going to be using in parts A, B, and C. The tax shield, the CCA tax shield for both the lessor and the lessee. Now, before getting into answering part A, I want to do a quick review from the leasing paradox video series, which I recommended you to watch before continuing on with this example, about what the range of lease payments means where the transaction is profitable for both parties, the lessor and the lessee. And the range of lease payments that makes the transaction profitable for both parties is basically when the NPV for the lessee is greater than 0 and the NPV for the lessor is greater than 0 as well. So if we can get a lease payment where the NPV for both parties is greater than 0, then that is a lease payment that will make the transaction profitable for both parties. And it's possible to get a range of lease payments sometimes, and we're going to see if it's possible in this question. So let's say the range of lease payments is from X, so the lease payments have to be either greater than or equal to X and less than or equal to Y. Let's just add these variables. So this is the potential range, and we're going to have to solve for X and Y in part A. Now, if you remember from the paradox video series, this X here, this lower end lease payment, the lower end of that interval, is the break even for the lessor. Right? So this payment here is basically the lease payment where the NPV for the lessor, or another word for this is the net advantage to leasing for the lessor, is going to equal 0. And then this here, this payment, the upper end of that range, is going to be when the NPV for the lessee is equal to 0, the break-even payment, or when the net advantage to leasing for the lessee is going to equal 0. So in part A, we're basically going to have to make two calculations. We're going to have to find the break-even lease payment for the lessor and the break-even payment for the lessee. And the reason why they're going to have to be two separate calculations is because of those different tax rates. Not only is the tax rate going to affect the tax shield portions, but it's also going to affect the after-tax discount rate, because this discount rate is on a before-tax basis. We always have to take the after-tax discount rate, and notice the after-tax discount rate is going to be different for both the lessor and the lessee. Now, in the previous two examples on leasing timing differences, we had to use an Excel file. We had to find these break-even lease payments manually. And that's why I mentioned at the beginning of this video that the only way to solve this question is with an Excel file. We're going to have to find those break-even payments for the lessor and the lessee manually as well. So we're going to start off by finding the lessor's break-even payment, and we're going to make a timeline, and we're going to have the leasing section and then the buying section as we did in the previous two questions on leasing timing differences. And then this is also going to be in the Excel file that I provide you. So starting off with the leasing section, if you remember, we have the lease payment. And in this case, we're going to be solving for the lease payment, the break-even lease payment. And we said the lease payment is going to be X for the lessor break-even. And the lease payments are happening at the beginning of each year for 4 years. So we know in time 0, there's going to be a lease payment X, time 1, X, X, and X as well. And then there's also going to be a tax shield associated with each of these lease payments. And that tax shield is going to happen at the end of each year because that's when we're going to be filing our taxes. That's when our taxes will be reduced. And the tax shield is always equal to the lease payment multiplied by the tax rate. And because we're dealing with the lessor in this case, we know the tax rate for the lessor is 35%. So the tax shield is just going to be 0.35x at the end of each year. And this is just basically the formula that I have in the Excel file. So if you input a tax rate of 35% on the side, you'll notice that this row here is just that tax rate multiplied by whatever lease payment is going to be there. And that lease payment you also input on the side. So that is the leasing portion of the timeline. And then we also need the buying cash flows, because if you remember when we're calculating the net advantage to leasing, we have to take the leasing cash flows, subtract the buying cash flows, and then present value those cash flows to times 0. So I just want to show you what each section is going to look like. So for the buying, we have the investment or the capital expenditure, which is basically the cost of the machine. And the cost of the machine is $120,000, so that's going to be over here in times 0. That's going to be negative $120,000. Now there's also a CCA tax shield involved with this machine, and we calculated that at the beginning of the question when we made the CCA schedule. And we need the CCA tax shield for the lessor specifically. So we took those CCA amounts and multiplied it by the tax rate for the lessor at the beginning, and we had the tax shield for the lessor in like a separate column. So now we're just going to input those values in this timeline. And those values were $21,000 in years 1 and 2 respectively. And again, because this is a tax shield, we assume we're filing the taxes at the end of each year. Hence, these tax shields are happening at the end of the first year, at the end of the second year at times 1 and 2. And then with buying, there's also a salvage value. And the salvage value in this case is just 0. So in time 4, that row is going to be 0. So these are the cash flows involved for the lessor. And then there's a bunch of other rows in the Excel file. You'll see there's basically the cash flows for leasing minus buying. Then I present value each column, and then I net it out to get the net advantage to leasing. And basically what you got to do at this point is you have to input a bunch of different lease payments on the side for X, where the net advantage to leasing, or the NPV for the lessor, is going to be 0. That's going to be the break-even lease payment. So it's all trial and error at this point. And when you do that process, you do that trial and error, you end up getting a lease payment of $32,381.72. And you'll notice that that payment makes the net advantage to leasing for the lessor equal to 0. So when you input this amount in the Excel file on the side, you'll see all of these numbers change here. They'll all fill up. And then at the very bottom, you'll see that net advantage to leasing equaling 0. So that there is the break-even lease payment for the lessor. That makes that NPV for them equal to 0. Now, if you wanted to check it manually, so if you inputted this for all of the X's here and then got their respective tax shields and then did the NPV calculation, another thing you got to remember is that discount rate, it's going to be 7%, which is given, but that's the before discount rate, and then you have to take 1 minus the tax rate for the lessor when you do that NPV calculation. If you want to try it manually, also in the Excel file, that's the discount rate that we are using, 7% times 0.65. And when you multiply these amounts, you end up getting 4.55%. So that's actually the discount rate that is being used in this specific calculation for the lessor whenever you're getting that NPV. It's not going to be the same discount rate that you're using for the lessee because the tax rate is going to be different. Hence, this value is going to be different. So just make a note of that. The discount rate is also affected by the tax rate. But either way, this is the payment. This is the break-even payment for the lessor that makes the NPV for them equal to 0. So now we're going to do the exact same thing except for the lessee. We're going to find their break-even payment. And the only difference between the lessor and the lessee is their tax rate. The lessee's tax rate is 10%, while the lessor's tax rate was 35%. So the lease payment, if you remember at the beginning, we made that range of lease payments and we said it's going to be between X and Y. Well, that Y now is the payment that makes the NPV, or the net advantage of leasing, of the lessee equal to 0. So we can label these lease payments as Y. And they are also happening at the beginning of each year. And then the tax shield now is going to happen at the end of each year. And it's going to be the tax rate for the lessee multiplied by the lease payments. So each of these is just going to be 0.1y. Right? So instead of 0.35, now it's 0.1 because the tax rate is different. Then the investment machine still costs $120,000. And now the CCA tax shield, if you remember at the beginning with the CCA schedule, was different for the lessee than it was for the lessor, again, because of the difference in the tax rates. And the tax shield for the lessee, if you remember that column, it was $6,000 in year 1, and then $6,000 in year 2. Then the salvage value is still 0 in time 4. So same thing, now you just got to do trial and error and input lease payments on the side in the Excel file that will make the net advantage of leasing, that final amount at the bottom in the Excel file for the lessee, equal to 0. So we're basically finding that break-even payment for the lessee. And when you do that trial and error process, you end up getting this break-even lease payment here, $32,903.56. When you input that in the Excel file on the side, you'll see all of this fill up, and you'll see that net advantage to leasing at the bottom equaling 0. And then if you were to take this and try it manually, so you would input this for all the lease payments, then the respective tax shields, and then you want to try to get that net advantage to leasing of 0 yourself, which I highly recommend you do, the discount rate is going to change as well. So that I that you're going to use is basically going to be the before discount rate of 7% multiplied by 1 minus the tax rate for the leasee, 0.1. And that would give you 7 times 0.9, which is 6.3%. So that's the discount rate you're going to be using to present value all of the cash flows. And that's the discount rate being used in the Excel file as well. As long as you're inputting a lease payment and then that correct tax rate on the side on that inputs column, that is the tax rate that is being used. And so our final answer for part A is this here. This is the range of lease payments that will make the transaction profitable for both parties. So any lease payment that you input into the Excel file between these numbers, and then you input the correct tax rates for the leasee and lessor depending on which one you're looking at, you'll notice that that net advantage to leasing amount at the bottom will always be positive for both, as long as the lease payment is between these. And just as a recap, this payment here we got by finding when does the net advantage to leasing for the lessor equal 0. And then this payment we got by finding when does the net advantage to the leasee equal 0. And then this gave us a range of lease payments where basically the net advantage to leasing for both parties within this range is going to be positive. So that is the answer to part A, and it's why I said you need the Excel sheet for it to calculate those break-even lease payments with these timing differences. If you remember from the Leasing Paradox video series, we didn't have to do that because we didn't have to deal with those timing differences. The tax shield and the lease payment were happening at the same time. But if you're dealing with the timing differences, then you gotta do it manually. And then once you have the answer to part A here, it's pretty easy to figure out parts B and C. You can actually do them manually now. So part B, they ask at a lease payment that has the leasee break even, so this payment here, this lease payment, what's the gain to the lessor going to be? So the way you do that is you take this lease payment here, you fill it out in the timeline. So this would be 32,903.56. The lease payments are happening at the beginning of each year. This would be 32,903.56. Same thing here. And then same thing here. Now, because with this lease payment, we are calculating the gain to the lessor, the tax rate that we're going to be using throughout is 35%. So now with these lease payments, you have to find what the tax shield is going to be for the lessor. So we just take these lease payments and multiply them by 0.35 by the lessor's tax rate. This is all from the lessor's point of view. And then those amounts you would just put at the end of each year. And when you do that calculation, taking the lease payment, multiplying it by that tax rate, you end up getting $11,516.25. And that tax shield is going to happen at the end of each year. Now, another thing I just noticed, hopefully you noticed this before me, is these lease payments should actually be negative cash flows. And I didn't mention that before. So those should be negative from the leasing point of view. You're spending money, and then the tax shields are positive. So that's it for the leasing portion of the timeline. What about the buying portion of the timeline? Well, the investment is just the cost of the machine. That's still $120,000. And then the CCA tax shield, because we are looking at this from the lessor's point of view, the CCA tax shield is from the lessor's point of view as well, And then at the beginning, we had the CCA tax shield for the lessor, and that was $21,000 in years 1 and 2. Then the salvage value is just 0. And then that's all the cash flows for the leasing and the buying. And now we can calculate what the net advantage to leasing is going to be for the lessor at that lease payment. So what we can do is we can take all of the leasing cash flows and then subtract all of the buying cash flows, and that's going to be this row over here. Usually, and you'll see in the Excel file as well, I have a row where I sum up or I net out all the leasing cash flows first, all the buying cash flows, and then I subtract those two net amounts. I didn't add that row just to save some room, but you're just basically taking all the cash flows from the leasing, subtracting all the cash flows from the buying, because that's how you calculate that net advantage to leasing like we went over before. And when you do that, when you subtract those two, you should end up getting these values in that row. And you can see these in the Excel file as well. And then you can just simply plug these values in to your financial calculator. So this would be CF0, CF1, CF2, CF3, CF4. And then you just plug in an interest rate of 4.55%. And the way we get that, again, 7% times 1 minus 0.35, which is the lessor's tax rate. And then you just calculate that NPV, or that net advantage to leasing. And when you do that, you'll end up getting negative $1,354. And notice that the net advantage to leasing in this case is negative, meaning that we should buy the machine. And that makes sense because we are looking at this from the lessor's point of view. And if you remember a lessor, what they do is they buy the machine, and then in this question, they're going to be leasing it out to the lessee. So if they are buying the machine, then the gain to them is $1,300.54, which is the negative amount for the net advantage to leasing. So that is the answer to part A. And you can get this amount again. For the Excel file on the side, you just input this lease payment, input this tax rate, and then everything should net out to this amount here. And again, because that net advantage to leasing is negative, from the buyer's perspective, from the lessor's perspective, that is a positive value. So the answer is $1,300.54. That's the lessor's gain if we use the break-even payment for the lessee that we found in part A. And then for part C, same exact thing as part B, but now we are using the break-even lease payment for the lessor, which was $32,381.72. And we're looking at this from the lessee's point of view. So the tax rate that we're going to use is 10%. So you input this lease payment, input that tax rate, and everything should fill out like this in the Excel file, and if you were to do it manually. So then when you take the cash flows from the leasing, subtract the cash flows from the buying, you end up getting these cash flows here. And then you can just input these in your financial calculator, CF0, CF1, CF2, CF3, CF4. And then the interest rate that you input is going to be the 7% times 1 minus 0.1. The tax rate changed, so the interest rate you're going to be using is 6.3%. And then you just calculate that NPV, and that will give you the net advantage to leasing. And that's from the lessee's point of view, because now we're using a tax rate of 10%. And when you do that calculation, you end up getting $1,729.43. Same thing that you should see in the Excel file. And because that is positive, then we should be leasing the machine. And that makes sense because we're looking at this from the lessee's point of view. So at a break-even lease payment to the lessor, of this amount, which we got in Part A, the lessee at a tax rate of 10% will have a gain of $1,729.43. So that is the answer to Part C, and that's a wrap for the question.